Okay. All right.
That's cool.
Yeah. So I'll just cut in about now then. You're notable in several different ways. One, I admire you just for the sheer cojones you have, but also you're incredibly prolific. But one thing that keeps on happening to you, and it's happened to me too, and other creators, is you keep on getting whacked by these major companies. Like a year ago, a year and a half ago, Patreon kicked you off, and you've had problems with YouTube. And I kind of want to know why you're so dangerous, or why are you so threatening to these companies?
Um, I think it's because I am directly critical of the moral atmosphere of their companies. I don't think they're as moral as they think they are. And I think that that is interpreted as something harmful, and I disagree. I'm a lot more Aristotelian than I am Platonic, and I would say they're a lot more Platonic than they are Aristotelian, I guess, if I was to boil it down to its most basic elements. And so I think that virtue is, morality is determined by what you do, and they think that morality is determined by what you believe. And I think that these two positions are actually incompatible, because that one makes the other justified, essentially. And I think that they're doing it in reverse, and I think they're doing it the wrong way. And I think that's why we have such problems with leftist philosophy and mass murder. And it's not that I think they're going to mass murder people. It's just I don't think taking the same approach is, in fact, the right thing to do. I think that morality, it should be determined procedurally, whereas they have a conceptual version of morality. For example, they'll say, well, if women only earned three quarters as much as men earned, therefore there is a problem. But that doesn't follow, in my opinion, because I think that the way that women earn their money and the way that men earn their money, that is how the money itself is justified. The end result is the product of a presupposition on their part that men and women are exactly the same. But anyone who knows anything about the subject will go through and say, well, hang on a second, men work about 15-20% more hours a year, well, a week, but obviously over the year, than women. Therefore, why wouldn't they earn more money? It would actually be strange if they still earned the same, but that doesn't matter because reasons. So that's but what I'm proposing is dangerous to a philosophy that's built that way, because I've just undercut their entire position. It's actually unreasonable to expect men and women to have the same at the end. So anyone who's come along and said, well, men are earning more than women, therefore women are being oppressed, is obviously ridiculous. That person is that their position has been totally undercut. That can't be the case. You wouldn't infer that given the premises. So they've started with a faulty conclusion and are trying to find an inductive reason why to find that. And I think that I'm breaking those reasons, and I think that's what makes me a problem ultimately. I'm also someone who enjoys himself, who makes jokes online, and some of my jokes have landed me in trouble. But that the reason my jokes have landed me in trouble is because I'm going after the sacred cows with them. That's essentially it, I think. And it's because I haven't apologized for offending these people, because I don't think I've done anything wrong.
Isn't your way in the world is through talking? So you're basically
Yes.
engaging with people verbally, and that's basically what you're doing in the world.
Yes.
Is wrangling with beliefs. So how do your beliefs form procedurally when what you're basically doing is just talking about beliefs? How do you justify and see the reality of your beliefs when you're just in this flux of
Well, I mean,
argument constantly?
you're not really. It's your actions that you're being determined by. But I mean, you can tell a person by their actions. Usually, the way they deal with money, in fact, is a really good indicator. If they pay their debts, pay their bills, are generous in themselves, you can see the virtue. And that's actually something that's quite easy to do online, because it's actually very easy to move money around. But obviously, as you say, when you're sat behind a desk and you're just talking to people via the internet, it's very difficult to show that you're virtuous. But I'm not claiming that I am virtuous either, by the way. I'm just claiming that I think this is a more moral way to approach things. And obviously in my daily life, I do try to be as virtuous as possible, but like it's something that most people have got figured out, because they've just got their lives worked out and they get on with things and they live good and decent lives. But But yeah, no, I'm not saying that it is necessarily, but I mean, there are ways, like, being charitable, being polite, and I've not always done this. I'm not saying that, like I said, I'm not claiming to be the virtuous person. I'm just saying, like, it seems to be a better method, and we end up with a better consequence, a better result, if we approach it through this method rather than the other method.
How do you think that
I
these
do my best.
Aristotelians, as you call them, are these people who, or no, I'm sorry, the Platonists then, or people who base their values on a belief system rather than a way of behaving? How do you think they got?
We can sorry to
No.
interrupt. We can actually define them very specifically in terms that we don't have to use the vague. They Continental Enlightenment thinking has always been distinctly collectivist from the French Revolution across the Marx, across the fascists, and it's a product of certain types of thought in certain periods of time. I come from the British tradition, the British liberal tradition that starts in England and then is exported to the colonies and then to the American Revolution. So that's a completely different trajectory, and so that's where I find myself compared to the Continentals. So I would personally use the term like the English liberals versus Continentals. Continentals, you could call them socialists, I suppose.
Would you be able to, on the fly, give like the basic axioms of the English British liberal versus the Continental?
Yes. Yes. The focus of it primarily is that government's power should be limited. That's the cardinal rule, because the entire thing is predicated on property, and the basic idea is that you are your own property and you own yourself. And so the government's ability to dispose of you is limited because you are actually the person in control of yourself. That's what freedom is. The Continentals, it seems to me that there's actually a distinction between freedom and liberty, because liberty seems to be something that must be constructed. There's famously in The Social Contract, Rousseau said, and I always, this phrase always really, I mean, I love Rousseau's writing, but this phrase was always just like, we will force them to be free. And I always thought that's interesting, because freedom is necessarily the absence of force, is it not?
It sounds like the George W. Bush foreign policy.
Well, right, and then you see, I think it's from this root, this difference of the sort of freedom versus liberty difference, and this is something I've just been playing around with. I've never really articulated it like this before, but I think it's relevant. I think it's from this you get the different aspects, and you can see the difference. Like in France, they have a bureau, a government bureau that deals with the French language, officially deals with the French language, and so they have recently decided that coronavirus is female, so it's la coronavirus in French rather than le coronavirus. And I'm just thinking, like, this forced them to be free, as if there is an authority that can decide that. But a free society language is the product of people just using words that they need to express terms. You can't have a top-down view of language. That's so authoritarian to me. I find that tyrannical. I'll use the words I want, thank you, and I'll mean them to mean what I want them to mean. And it's in this just shows you the sort of worldview difference. You couldn't do that in the English-speaking world, but you can do that in the French-speaking world. And so that's the primary philosophical difference in the Enlightenment that I think that we're wrangling with today, because all of the English-speaking countries are having real problems with socialism and socialists. And just listen to the words that come out of their mouth. Obviously, Marx, Lenin, whoever, like Kropotkin at the most, balmy ends of it. And they use phrases like no passeran. It's like, why would you not be able to articulate this? No passeran, no passage. It's an anti-Fa slogan that they've adopted. I think it was from the Spanish Civil War. I think it's Spanish, where the anarchists were fighting the fascists. But it's all very alien to the sort of English-speaking tradition, because people don't understand the difference in the worldviews. And the English language itself, just the way that we think, has baked in assumptions and differences. Yeah. Like the structure of the sentences is different, the gendering of certain words, and allocation of blame as well is different. English is famously the language that places blame quickest, But then if you're an individualist, if you have an individualistic worldview and you don't believe that the state has the authority to dispose of you as it pleases, you are the one who's responsible for what you do. And so naturally you would want to find who is to be held accountable for what has happened as quickly as possible. So all of these things, I know that this all sounds like, oh, this all sounds a bit like airy or something, but I think there is tangible differences here, and I think that's what they come down to. I hope that answered the question. Now I've got to it. I can't remember what it was. Sorry.
What's
my own world.
What's the limiting principle of these two views? Let's say America ran with a certain worldview and is now, we could argue, captured by this other worldview, and Europe, the continental Europe, ran with these ideas. And where do these two ideas end up when they're applied to the society at large?
Well,
and are they necessarily at conflict when they get to the societal level, these two competing societies?
Yes, there is necessarily a conflict. Because in the continental view, the state has license to enter almost every facet of one's life. But in the English view, the state is there to protect your life, your freedom, and your property. So that's it. So this is why in the English-speaking countries, the coronavirus lockdown felt really strange, right? It was very, very encouraged in Europe, but it was very weird over here. And the Celtic nations in Britain are very much European thinking in this regard in some ways as well, actually. Don't chew me out, my Celtic bros. But they actually kind of are, and it's and so it goes really against what the mandate of the state is, to tell a business owner he has to shut his business for no reason other than the public health, some greater good. And so, there are tangible differences.
Is there, like with World War II, America was basically conscripted by the government to fight in this war. So do you think that was justified then? Do you think that there's a time where collectivism should rule? And how do you know what that time is?
Individualism is a product of safety. That's what it's a product of. It's a product of a society that is not in imminent danger of being taken out. And if Nazi Germany invades the rest of Europe, then yes, in times of dire need, you will indeed have to become authoritarian. The government will have to set in motion, especially with the scale of war now as well. Wars can take up entire countries, entire continents now. So there is obviously a justification there. You can't really argue with it. Necessity is as necessity is. But you'll notice that the Western countries liberalized afterwards. We didn't maintain that kind of authoritarian regime, whereas in the East, things hardly became like the communists promised the utopia will be, did it? Mm-hmm. So that's why I think that we have the superior perspective on these things as well.
It's interesting that the Nazi rhetoric really stepped up when the authoritarians, the modern day authoritarians that are operating under the guise of progressivism, began to make their big moves. That it became more and more acceptable. And maybe I'm misconstruing things because the internet's the internet, and it's kind of a meme in and of itself to call your opponents a Nazi. But it really seemed that rhetoric came at the same time that a lot of justifications for authoritarianism began to take place within the academy and within certain very huge private businesses.
I don't know about the timing necessarily, but I think the seeds of it have been placed for quite some time, because you'll notice that people in Britain's hate crime law, in fact, Scotland's hate crime laws are a great example of this. Britain has hate crime laws, and they're bad enough, but they're not as bad as the new ones that are being proposed by the Scottish National Party, which ironically is actually now the Scottish International Party. But anyway, I don't get that. But the point is, they're concerned with possible incitement to action, and this is being extended beyond, because in common law we don't have any, and every English-speaking country is a common law country. In fact, common law is another great example of the differences between the continent and Britain, England specifically. The English common law is actually the servant of the regular man. It doesn't. The authority is actually not from the king, which is why England was the first country in Europe to make the king follow what ostensibly were his own laws. But obviously, this has graduated to understanding that the sovereignty is in the people themselves, not just the sovereign. But in France, you have the inquisitorial system, where the state is actually conducting it on its own behalf, whereas in Britain, the judge is a neutral arbiter between two parties in civil law. And so the Christ, what was the question again? Sorry, I keep going off these tangents.
I was tangentially with you.
There's a lot you've got to pull together, because it was why are they becoming authoritarian now, wasn't it?
Yeah. Right. And it's basically, I guess, we can really root it in why are these major companies that are benefiting from, let's say, a form of capitalism, let's say Google, YouTube, Facebook, they become so big, and then all these institutions, including the academy, are now captured by this system that seems alien to the founding principles that got them up and running.
Yeah, it absolutely is alien to the United States and its founding principles. You're completely right. The problem is they have no good defense against it, because it's fundamentally predicated on their own axioms, which is freedom. These are just expanded. Freedom to what? Well, freedom to everything, according to the communists. The whole point of communism is to end the nuclear family, it's to end private property, and to have essentially as few people dependent on any kind of bond or requirement as possible. And that, in my opinion, is probably highly undesirable. I think that you are looking at the end of the family. If you can achieve a state where, because if you look at it, human relationships are all done through some form of necessity. And if you destroy necessity, then you destroy human relationships.
Do you think that the theoretical destruction of necessity necessitated the move to destroy any sort of family bonds? Could you walk us through how you get to communists want to kill the family, like that statement? Like
no, they don't want to kill people or anything, but they
end up doing it. But
sure, but that's not what they're aiming at.
Yeah,
they're just Continentals. So. The liberal view of the state and society is there's a difference between the state and society. But the communist view is that there shouldn't be a state. And so what they want to do is effectively remove any form of oppression. They're looking for liberation, right? They're looking, in Marx's view, it's the liberation of the working class against the bourgeois oppressors, and to eventually make everyone working class. And the liberal view is actually to try and make everyone bourgeois. But the communist can't justify any kind of hierarchy or class structure. The antithesis of communism is any kind of hierarchical structure. Obviously, George Orwell is pointing out in Animal Farm, well, look, the people put in power to destroy any kind of class structure become the new class. It's not possible. Jordan Peterson's making... Sorry, I've got a real frog in my throat.
That's fine.
Jordan
it is fascinating that Peterson is so strongly reacted to, or was, during his heyday.
Oh, absolutely, because this is the very core of their philosophy that he's going against. He's saying, look, hierarchies are not always oppressive. A lot of the time they're justified. A lot of the time people want hierarchies. People are looking for people to follow. And the idea of hierarchies in animals is older than trees. You know, it's ancient, and it's 350 million years or something. And obviously, anyone can look at any pets they've had, any kind of animals in a group, and they can see a hierarchy. Humans are no different, unless we think that somehow we're not evolutionary and we're a product of divine revelation, magical creation or something. But obviously humans are the same. But this is the worst thing a communist can hear, because from the communist perspective, all men are not only equal, they should all be as equally free in every regard. Because, I mean, there's a part of me that's starting to kind of dislike the Enlightenment and the claims that it makes for itself, because they're so lofty. They're so lofty. It's, oh, well, everything can be done from reason. The will itself, the will, we can essentially free our wills
Yeah.
to be these, magical brains that exist beyond our bodies. And it's like, but our brain is a product of our body. There's no escaping the material nature of what a human is. And so trying to disconnect our reason and our personalities from this is actually a ludicrous and it's a fool's errand. It's totally ludicrous. It's not going to happen. But anyway, yeah, the communists are effectively trying to make it so that we can will anything we want. And this means that all barriers have to be broken down. But this is a problem because, all of our relationships are built on necessity. You have friends because you want to have friends. You need to have friends. You need a social life. You're a human being. You need comfort from other people. This is why the lockdown is such a problem. There are so many people freaking out because a bunch of lonely singleton millennials who don't have anyone. They don't have families. And so they're upset. And the rates of depression are skyrocketing at the moment. What's also skyrocketing? Well, people not getting married. That's totally, these things I think are all connected together. And I think it is essentially the communist effect on society that's happening where these things are breaking apart. But this is why they're in favor of social programs. This is why they essentially want anyone to be able to do anything at any time and have any of their decisions underwritten by the government. That's if you don't like your parents telling you actually you're a boy, not a girl, then you should be able to leave home because you're being oppressed. It's like, is that oppression or is that their parents disagreeing with an opinion they have? I really think we're extending the definition of the word oppression here. But yeah, anyway.
You make I don't know if it's a dichotomy, but it seems like you're arguing that Continentalism concept of liberty is founded on the escape or the relief from oppression, and yes. I'm wondering if you have this British classical liberalism view that's based on what you term freedom, how does freedom manifest itself and get along with hierarchy? Is hierarchy not a limitation of freedom? Is there not certain foundational limitations that provide for greater freedons that should come into harmony?
It's very clear that in the English conception of these things, it's not very abstract, actually. It's actually very concrete, and it's designed purely focused around limitations on government. That's what it's concerned with. But the continental view of liberty has initially began with limits on government, but very quickly expanded into. With the French Revolution, it was expressly is a liberal revolution, so it's about limits on government. But then you move into socialism, where it's now it's economic problems, and then you move into fascism, where it's essentially the entire person, and that's a position that's effectively been taken over by the social justice brigade of today. Every aspect of your identity within sectionality is now something that should be free, quote unquote. So it is very different to the English conception. So there's definitely a dichotomy there, in my opinion.
How do you create tremendous systems without some form of collectivism, like the internet or roadways or the functions that Google serves?
So the collectivism is not groups of people acting in concert. Collectivism is a term for a specific method of governance, and it's the difference is that individualism values the individual above the group, and collectivism values the group above the collective, specifically the rights of. An individualistic society doesn't recognize group rights, but it might recognize group interests. It's not the same thing. And so there's no contradiction with being an individualistic society, which essentially means a constitutional society, or versus an ethical society. Ethical meaning that the state itself has a moral goal that it is trying to achieve for society. The fascists wrote in opposition to the liberal society being the constitutional night watchman, there to protect your rights, to make sure you don't get stolen from or beaten up or whatever. But otherwise, it's not really there to fix your life. That's your job. But the continental model is the ethical society where the state has a role to try and improve you and try and fix your life. So that's the difference. So in an individualistic society, obviously people can cooperate as much as they want, and they will, and they'll form hierarchies because it's in their nature to do so. They just won't be impeded from doing this unnecessarily by government or forced to do this by government. So that's the difference, really.
And why do you think a company like, let's say, YouTube is now, which
Right.
it seems to spring up from certain principles of do-it-yourself and work together, group interests, but is now going into a top-down? Is there kind of some sort of weird leverage or momentum where these huge groups just inevitably turn into or get captured by those who want to dictate ethics?
I can't say that I'm sure of this for certain, right? So this is all quite speculative because
it's not a conspiracy; it's speculation.
Yeah, no. Like there's no conspiracy needed. Like we're just talking about the behavior of people. Why they behave in the way that they behave. So it's no need for any conspiratorial thinking. But I don't think the answer is something anyone has actually nailed down. However, I think that there's a kind of inevitability about the arguments that are made, because all arguments essentially function in the same way. Conclusions follow from premises, and depending on the way that you define certain things, I think that the use of the terms can easily be like made fluid and made to run into one another. For example, freedom and liberty. I don't think anyone really would think of the distinction between the two. They'd use them as synonyms. And so you can launder one idea through the other if no one is being specific and careful about these things.
Equality and equity is a perfect example of that.
Precise. And equality itself is a great question because there are so many questions regarding the concept of equality and so many different interpretations. And it's a word I actually hate using. I would rather use terms like peer or something like that, because we can agree that we're all peers without all being equal, at least in material respects, but we might all have the same political rights, which would make us peers, So I would prefer to use language like that because it's more specific. It's got a narrower focus on a particular kind, like, political peerage or something. But yeah, the problem is, I think that these arguments are okay. So one of the differences between English liberalism and continental liberalism, as manifested in the French Revolution, was honestly, I think the lack of material nature of the English concern. Sorry, that's not the right way to phrase it. It isn't entirely materialist. For example, John Locke, who heavily influenced the Founding Fathers, thought it should be made illegal to become an atheist or to advocate for atheism because he thought it would remove the moral underpinning of society and bring us all to chaos. Well, this was actually the first sort of thing that the French Revolution did. It persecuted churches. It deliberately set up a cult of reason, which Robespierre thought was awful. And then going into the communists, 100% materialistic. They do not believe in anything that's not material. And this caused them to have to create scientific atheism. And they killed something like 20 million Christians on the grounds that they were Christian, burned churches and monasteries all across Russia, things like this. So it was a complete, so that you can see the difference in the English and the continental one immediately, because the English one is predicated on the idea that there is a spiritual aspect to us, and I'm an atheist, so I don't believe myself, but that's just what they thought. But it was predicated on the idea that, look, you will have your own moral guide, and it doesn't have to be the government. But when you compress it down to a materialist view where there is nothing other than the world around us, then the government essentially does become God in that regard, because it is the most powerful entity. It lasts through space and time. It's what gives birth to you if it's in control of the entire state, which is what the fascists wanted. So you can see the distinction. And I think that honestly, the people are going to crucify me for this, but a lack of religion is a problem for English liberalism. It is a problem, to not have religious principles, or not just religious, moral principles that exist outside of materialism, means that effectively you can't really argue against materialism. And I think the way we see this reflected in the English-speaking world now is that primarily it seems that our morality is entirely consequentialist and utilitarian, as in if nobody is apparently hurt, we say that there's nothing wrong with that thing, right? You can see this in the widespread adoption of an acceptance of pornography. Now, again, I'm one of these people. I'm not against any of these things, but you have to accept that there are problems with pornography. You know, it does affect young men. There are studies that show it actually does damage their brains. It causes like erectile dysfunction in young men. You know, if they watch porn from like 10 or something onwards, and then, you know, they get a girlfriend and it's not like what they're, you know, conditioned to accept. There are problems with it, but in the immediate, when you catch someone watching porn, how do you shame them for that? You know, it's that if you know, no one appears to be hurt, it all seems to be built on Mill's harm principle, and this is why I've been talking about the concept of virtue, in fact, because from the position of a virtue ethicist, there is a complaint to that. Is it virtuous to watch porn? No one's going to tell you it's virtuous to watch porn. They might say it doesn't matter, you know, they might say it's morally neutral, but they're not going to say it's good. You know, it's probably not good to watch porn. I'm one of those people who thinks that in any individual act of watching porn is morally neutral. You know, as long as it's consenting on both sides, etc., etc. But it's not good. You know, I wouldn't want my son to watch porn. I would want him to get a girlfriend and get married and have kids. You know, so there is room to push out the harm principle a bit with virtue ethics, which is, I think, useful, because I think it's the commitment to the harm principle that's allowed the materialists to come in with what they call moral arguments and be very persuasive, because we find ourselves with no meat with which to push back because we are no longer religious.
Okay, so let's go back to YouTube. So YouTube is the best. You know, it's the worst, but it's also the only platform to be on if you want an audience. Yeah. But it's now taking it upon itself to enforce certain sorts of virtue, or to mitigate the harm of certain thoughts, ideas, and realities, personalities, and I guess just information. They want to be able to take that role upon themselves. You're against that, but how do you stop a company from assuming that power? How do you allow for a company like that to rise up and exist in like with competition or whatever it is that makes them what they are, and not then turn around and become detrimental to the society that it's lifting up?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Because I watched an interview with Susan Wojcicki the other day, and she was saying how she has a duty to force certain kinds of content on people, even though they don't want it. This happened during the Nice attack in 2016, I believe it was, where in France, localized to that country, she had ordered her team that deals with the algorithm in whatever way when breaking news occurs to only promote certain kinds of discussion about that from what we'll just generally term the mainstream media, but to France. And apparently the response from the engineers was, okay, but people don't want this, you know, and they can tell from their metrics, you know, how much of the clip people watch and whether, you know, how they engage with it and stuff. People were annoyed and they would get declining viewer interaction and viewing rates. But she was saying, well, no, I think it's the job of YouTube to essentially make sure that people get this information. And so she has taken it upon herself, though through no way being elected or anything like this, by any kind of public consent, to begin engineering what people can see. But the thing is, there's a kind of social contract in YouTube when it first started. It was in their slogan, broadcast yourself. The idea it would be just an open platform to people to put their videos on of themselves, whatever it was that they want to talk about, and this would be a way for the world to be able to talk. If you go back on that, especially without telling people, there seems to be something a bit unethical there, doesn't there? Seems to be, you know, you began this, and she was there at the beginning as well with all of this. She's been with them for a long time. I think it was with Google, but she's been involved with this for a long time. But there was an understanding that wouldn't be something that would be coercive or subtle or manipulative or anything like that. It was understood to be an open thing, and for a long time it really was. But of course this led to political perspectives that are not being very well favored at the moment to rise to prominence, because probably there's a kernel of truth in each one that pushes the thing up. I don't know what we can do to stop it. To be honest, I don't know what we can do to stop it. It seems that we just need to have a discussion about these things. And Susan does do a lot of interviews, so I'm not saying that she'll never be asked about this or have these ideas put into her head so she can percolate about them and think about them. Okay. But no, she does believe that they have an ethical duty. And the thing is that you can make arguments that they do. I mean, well, you could begin with saying, well, people voluntarily use YouTube. They're endorsing her by using her platform, and therefore this gives her license or something like this. Yeah. You could make arguments like that, but I think they'd be a bit weak. But there's not really a lot we can do to prevent them from doing this. We made a rod for our own backs here, really.
But do you think that they're operating under certain principles that can be challenged by your principles? Do you think that you could, by indirect means, just by keep on putting it out into the water, keep on arguing for this stuff, change the direction of these huge companies, and there's a lot of them, that are expending their authority? The colleges are expending their accumulated authority by cashing out on these really stupid ideas that newfangled professors are coming up with or possessed by. Do you just let those ideas run its course, and do you just keep on playing with the machine, inside the machine, being oppressed by the machine, and by oppressed, just, I guess, cut out from various different monetary sources and squelched by it? What do you do?
Squelched by the algorithm, yeah. Well, I mean, yes, all arguments interface with other arguments, so you can make an argument that would hopefully counteract what she thinks and change her perspective. The problem is that, I mean, her perspective comes from an Enlightenment basis, and so it's difficult for liberals to be able to argue convincingly against communists. Liberals have to be able to make a firm argument for the inevitability of hierarchy. But not only that, I think the necessity of adversity, I think that's what the liberals have to start making an argument for, because I think that, I mean, anyone who's met a rich, spoiled kid will know that these are not very nice people. These are people who you find insufferable. They're not very considerate of others. They're very quick. No, they're very quick to assume that they are right to disengage or act out in certain ways because of and they've never had any concern about the reactions of other people. Mummy and daddy will always be there, obviously. The money will always be there. So it doesn't actually matter how anyone else treats them. They have always got this secure position to operate from. Again, like the no necessity in any of these relationships, right? Okay. So there's if they're the one hosting the party because they've got the big house, they can act in any way they want because they don't need any of these people. They'll always be able to get more people. Whereas if you're a regular person, you don't have that kind of security. So you've got to be concerned about the people around you, and these relationships become rich because of it. Mutual concern, and so I think that if we end up getting to that point, we will create human beings that we don't really like. We wouldn't like these people. And it's like, okay, well, why would we allow ourselves to be in a situation to create generation upon generation upon generation? Because if you think that the millennials are bad, imagine what they would be like if they didn't have any real problems. I mean, millennials at least have real problems. They're hard, struggling to get ahead financially. And they are. They're saddled with huge amounts of debt. Yes, they are. Turns out that gender studies degree wasn't as vital as you thought. But imagine if they didn't have any. I mean, but the very least, you can say that they're secure from physical problems. Most physical dangers are not something that they have to worry about. Now, imagine if you've got these people who have got just no other problems. They're given $1,000 every month for no particular reason. They just get it, and so now they don't need anyone for anything. Fuck you all. Fuck everyone. Watch me on my Instagram getting tens of thousands of likes and just I don't need anyone. Do we want humanity to become like that? Because I actually really don't. And so essentially we need to start making an argument for, look, you actually need to figure it out yourself, and this is a motivating force that makes you a better person. And again, like virtue, it comes back to the things you're doing. The virtue is in a repeated habit. And I think it's not something, again, I've fully fleshed out, but I think it's something that if we're gonna defeat communism and not become a bunch of insufferable communist shitheels until everything collapses, then it's got to be through expecting standards from one another.
Were you communist? Had communist leanings when you were like 11 or 12 or 16 or 17?
No, like most people, I was well into my 20s. I was never a communist. But
did you get an opportunity to be attracted to it and to grow out of it? I guess that's the question.
Yes, I was never very political, to be honest, when I was younger. In my 20s, like I remember reading about 2/3 of Capital when I was about 24, and I stopped because it was insufferably boring. But I remember going through it and just thinking, well, okay, that seems like a reasonable critique, but the solutions he's proposing I disagree with. And at the time I didn't know it, but it seems anachronistic now. The problems that Marx was facing with capitalism, not unjustified either, just don't exist anymore. Capitalism, turns out, is not the monolithic, like, industrial force that is on the rails and will always do exactly the thing. No, capitalism is actually very malleable, and it bends and shifts compared to what we want, actually, which is actually good. You want something like that that's responsive to change. Again, the Marxists see this as weakness, but it's like, no, that's usefulness. That's good. I consider myself left wing, and I was a fan of like the New Atheists and stuff. So obviously, religious texts themselves, there are no religions that stand up to any kind of scrutiny using reason. However, that doesn't mean that our societies, and especially our moral structures, were built on ideas that were contained within them. Dawkins the other day, I think, did say something like, I kind of regret going so hard on Christianity now, because it could still have been a bit useful in some ways. And it's like, yes, but I didn't realize that either. I didn't think about it. And it's only in hindsight that these things become apparent, isn't it? So I was never really a socialist, but I understood that, I have been poor. I've been very poor, and I've needed to rely on government assistance. So job seekers allowance, it's called in Britain. So, but it was, I was finding a job. I found a job, obviously, and then blah blah blah. So I'm not unsympathetic to that at all. I understand that there can be a liberal argument, a social liberal argument made for the protection of the people who find themselves, through not necessarily any fault of their own, just down on their luck with no one to help and no other options. I can definitely see there being a sort of socially conscious argument for that. And I'm not unsympathetic to it even now. But I am unsympathetic to it when it's advanced by a fucking communist, because that's not what they want. That's the step. That's the first step into, now we can seize the means of production, comrade. It's like, no, because that's mine. I made this. You don't get to just take it.
Were you arguing that the UBI would be the death of ambition?
I think the slow death of ambition. Yeah.
Do you think that it's inevitable that you have these kind of not necessarily hypocritical, but very ironically well-off communists, these people who don't have enough necessity and yet want to redesign society around give or give all kind of?
So the communists seem to want to unleash the artist and musician and scientist in everyone. But they don't really understand that not everyone has an artist, scientist, or musician in them. So some people are not very inclined that way. And if you give people access to all the resources they want, then you're going to give them access to drugs and alcohol. And I hate to say it, but I think a larger and larger percentage of people will simply become addicted to these things. I'm not and I don't just mean use occasionally, like have a beer or two once a week or something like that, that's fine. Obviously, all things in moderation. I think you will increase the number of people who are generally harmed by these things, and you will also put them in a position where you don't really have much of a choice, do you? If, like, I have to invoke Aristotle, because I really think he's on the money here. When he's saying that, look, virtue is habituated, it's bred into you, it's what you regularly do. If every day you get up and you don't have anything to do, you don't have any need to do anything, you can just go to your robot dispensary, get your breakfast for today, and okay, what are you going to do? I might play video games. I might okay, well, it'll be a nice relaxing life, but it's not something that anyone's ever going to remember. It's not, I don't think you're going to be striving for increased excellence. I don't think you're going to demonstrate many virtues, and I think that UBI will definitely incentivize that. I mean, there's probably a segment of the population that would, overnight, something like 20% of the population would just fall into that category. And I think I myself in my 20s would have been exactly that person. I would have been exactly that person. And I think that percentage will probably grow because, I mean, why wouldn't it? What's the difference? Who cares? What difference does it make? So I think that UBI will be the death of accomplishment, to be honest, but it'll be a slow death. It'll be creeping, and it'll be generation after generation, assuming these people even reproduce, which they're not, So, I mean, no, I mean it. Like, freedom from everything means freedom from childbirth. It means freedom from parental responsibility. You can see the way that millennials talk about children is awful. It's absolutely awful. Like, oh, God, I hate children. I hate children. I'm a father. Spend any amount of time around kids, and if you come away saying you hate children, you are a psycho. You are some sort of unempathetic psycho. When any kid brings you something, look, I've discovered, and there's joy in their face, and they want to share that with you, if you can't find yourself loving kids then there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong. It's not that they hate kids, though. It's not they hate kids. It's they're afraid of responsibility. That's what it is. They're afraid of having any voice in the back of their head saying, you know what? You might have to have kids someday yourself. Maybe you should have kids. Maybe if you want there to be UBI, if you want there to be universal healthcare, someone has to create the doctors that are going to be treating you when you're an old lady or whatever. And if not you, then who? Oh, it'll be my neighbor. Well, what if they choose not to? What if their neighbors choose not to? What if we all choose not to? Then we end civilization. And the thing is, the materialist left can't even argue why that's bad. They can't even argue that the end of their own civilization is a bad thing, because it would have to speak to something more noble about the civilization that is in and of itself worth preserving. And that is not a material concept. What are we talking about here? Nobility, honor, sacrifice, courage. Like, you can't have these things in a materialist society. And I think that I don't think the world is entirely materialist. And this is from an atheist. I don't believe that any of the religions have told us anything about God. And I think that the ontological argument for God is a clever trick. But I do agree that there is something about the human experience that is more than simply the things around you.
How do you
emotional.
Earlier on, in a different conversation, you talked about the idea of reason being able to escape our biology. So it seems like under certain circumstances, we are the product of material existence. We are the product of biology. But on another level, we're not, or we have to not be constrained by that. How do you make that leap into this metaphysical world?
Hey, I don't think that me saying that that's their position is not my position. I recognize the contradiction in it as much as you've recognized it. We are not just materialist beings. Otherwise, what are you talking about? What is this consciousness that you think should have control over everything? I mean, like, look at it this way, right? So, you and I imagine, both believe that the consciousness is a predicate property of the body. So the body is something that's there, the brain is a part of the body, and the consciousness is generated by the brain. So if there is a problem with the consciousness, we would say that is also a physical problem with the body, and therefore it doesn't make sense then to identify a problem with the consciousness and say, right, okay, well, we'll impose that way on the body. You would say, right, okay, we need to change the body to help the consciousness. For example, transgenderism. Now, this is going to be a shocking thing to say, But I don't understand why we agree that if someone believes that they are a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body, that means give them hormones to change their body to the opposite sex. Because it strikes me that for example, one of the interesting things that's been going on at the moment is there have been a lot of effeminate gay men who have been persuaded that they are transgender, and I've spoken to many of these myself, who have come out of this on the other side going, no, I'm not. I am male. I am a man. I'm just gay, and I'm effeminate. I'm not a woman. And so, if taking female hormones would make a man feel more like a woman, then taking male hormones would make a man feel more like a man. And so why do we not just at least try when someone says, well, I feel like I'm a woman in a man's body? Why do we not
jack them up with testosterone? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Because if it was a woman who felt like she was a man trapped in a woman's body, we'd give her testosterone and she'd become more manly. She'd get all the hair. She would then, her behavior would change as well. And it does, because we are biological organisms. We are not simply just perfect wills of reason that just, we're superior above all material things. But yeah, like I said, I don't know why they think this.
How do you've decried the loss of religion, at least begrudgingly, and or at least Dawkins has. And
yes.
What do you do then if you notice that there needs to be some sort of narrative that ties everybody together and then that elicits certain virtues and that constellates adversity in a beneficial, productive way? You don't have that. You don't have that story because you're no longer allowed to believe in story. You're trapped in reason. You're trapped in argumentation. And insofar as, and it seems like communists win or the Continentals win or materialism wins when we're locked into a strictly rational, reasonable debate. They have a stronger debate. How do you escape that? What's your trajectory? Is it patriotism? Is it some sort of rhetorical, blaze, a meteoric,
Well, I think you summarized it perfectly there, and I wish I'd used that line at the outset. You're trapped in materialism when you approach things only through reason. Reason is not the only way to understand things, obviously. You can have intuitions and emotions and all these sort of things, and all of these things do exist, and they do dictate your life. Like Jonathan Haidt's work has been very instrumental in showing that for most people, reason is actually post hoc rationalization of something they have already done. And it's very difficult to persuade. Emotionally, they have to be very calm and secure and safe to persuade them of something that is drastically different. That they might have. There's the thing with Susan Wojcicki. Like, I would probably have to sit down for an evening with her and, have a few drinks, get to know her, and then look, you have to understand where I'm coming from, so she can understand that I'm a good faith actor and I'm not trying to hurt people, but I'm actually presenting a different worldview that, this is why I don't think it's possible this can change. But yeah, summarizing it as reason traps you in materialism, that's true. And that's not to say that you can't use reason, obviously, but putting reason as the only thing that is of any value is a dangerous thing to do. And again, this again is why I'm interested in Aristotle at the moment, because Aristotle is not giving us anything religious. He is not speaking about gods. He is not speaking. When he uses the term soul, he means consciousness. He means ourselves, the thing that we think of when we think of us, but not our physical bodies. The sort of consciousness of a person, and he's direct and practical and isn't just material. Doing something virtuous is good for its own sake because doing virtuous things is good. So I think this is actually a very strong argument against the communists, because the outcome of virtue is beauty. This is something think about anything.
Well, we already postmodernism killed beauty, so that's off the table, right? And goodness too. How do we get back to how do you even define virtue? How do we even define virtue?
Well, it's that which is good for human flourishing. A thing that produces good condition is wholesome. Virtue, I mean, the Aristotelian view, it's the intermediate point between excess and defect. So, and you'll find that this is the point at which human flourishing occurs. So, if you're a runner, say you want to be a good runner, you don't go running for 50 miles every single day because you end up shredding your knees or the thighs or something. You end up hurting your legs, so you can't actually run. That'd be an excessive practice. But then if you literally never got up and went and practiced, that'd be a deficiency of it. So practicing, run like, I don't know, 20 miles a day or something, whatever it is, and then take a day's rest. Whatever it is that keeps you in good condition without damaging you in excess or defect is how we would identify virtue. And good condition is something that Aristotle thought we were innately programmed to be able to identify because of the purpose of the thing. You can identify a shovel that's in good condition by the fact that it's not broken and you can scoop with it, etc., etc. It's all old. The way he looks at things is very old. It's not very scientific, but I think there is an essence of truth in it, which is why he could identify it and just how he categorized it. But especially when it comes to virtue, I think that everyone can see someone who is virtuous. And this is why I think people hate fat superheroes. I don't think people like fat superheroes because the superhero is meant to be like, a big, strong paragon virtue who does all this stuff. And it's like, able, exactly, competent, capable. And if you look at someone who's fat, I'm fat myself, so I speak from a position of knowledge. You're not as capable, and you are certainly not as virtuous when it comes to exercise. I think that there is something in that, but I'm not sure. I'm not saying I've got to the bottom of it yet.
Yeah. Well, do you think that a UBI there can be like some sort of restraint on that allows it to be somewhere between excess and a flaw, or social programs themselves, or different sorts of content policing policies that do walk the line between excess and
I think there certainly are. I think UBI is different as a status to YouTube, although there's a part of me that's afraid that effectively the future is every single person on Earth on social media getting paid by the post on, say, Twitter. So they're financially incentivized to post on the whatever the equivalent of Twitter is in the far future, and that's just human understanding of the world, Matrix style in this thing.
Well, we're already there.
I mean, thankfully we're not quite there, but we've got a glimpse of it, I think. And I think that's actually a terrifying future. It's like, God, you don't recognize that as the state of a human, the condition of a human. But yeah, I think there is a reasonable excess and mean that can be excess and defect that can be mitted against, and there should be. Things that are illegal, YouTube should police. I think there can even be an argument for harassment that I think YouTube can police. And I've always been accused of this, but I've always said in all of my videos, look, just don't go and talk to this person. They don't want to hear from you. I don't want you talking to them particularly, but people, when they see something that they, on a moral level, fundamentally disagree with, they want to go and give that person a piece of their mind. It's you can't stop it. The only way to stop it would be to not talk about the thing, but I'm not prepared to go that far. So all I can do is encourage people to do it. But I can understand the argument from the other side, because I've had plenty of people who have, especially when I had smaller platforms, who would send a lot of people my way. It's not very pleasant. It's not a pleasant thing. I'm not saying it's something that you shouldn't be able to handle. You probably should be able to handle it as an adult, who can press the block button or just log off of the internet. But you have to concede that it's not a very nice experience, and it does happen, even if you're not trying to make it happen, which a lot of people aren't. So I can understand why YouTube would feel that they have a duty to try and do something about this. But the problem is their tools are really quite limited. If people are allowed to talk about subjects, well, you got to expect that there are going to be people like, well, I can watch this video. Well, I watched it, right. I can log on to Twitter. Yes, I can do that. I can send this tweet. And the tweet might not even be a tweet that violates the rules, just like, you're an idiot. I disagree with you firmly. And if you get, 50,000 of these, maybe you will be going like, Christ, But, it's all quite amplified, And but I mean, it's all part of a social mechanism that's just designed to make you think about what you've done. But I can see the argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I can see where they're coming from. So
a social mechanism to make you think about what you've done. Could you expand on that?
Yeah. It's the way society polices itself. It's the kind of
Okay, yeah.
organic
The
way,
mob,
you know.
the cancel
Not necessarily the
crew.
mob,
No, okay,
but just I wouldn't call it the mob. I mean, for example, if you're in a pub and you're just sat there with your friend and you can hear two other people who are, I don't know, talking about the Holocaust or something, you know, and they're like, yeah, one of them, you know, they're both agreeing that, yeah, it didn't happen and actually Adolf Hitler was great. You might feel morally obliged to say, hey, look, I don't mean to interrupt, but you're wrong on this and Adolf Hitler was awful. You know, let me explain why. And they've got to kind of expect that if they're going to be voicing these opinions in a public place, that there are going to be people who feel obliged to at least comment on it or something like that. And I think that's totally fair. And I think that's the way that society regulates itself and, like, you know, transmits ideas and figures out which ones are good and bad and things like this. And this seems to have been amplified with social media. So when you've got, you know, something like 1 million Twitter followers, yeah, you're going to get the same effect, but not just one guy going up to two guys in a pub and going, "You're wrong, I hate you." It'll be millions of people saying this, you know. So, yeah.
How have you navigated that? I mean, you started small, and you're not small anymore. And was that a learning curve? How do you maintain integrity to yourself, not be captured by your audience, and then how do you take responsibility for your audience too? Like, what are some of the things that you've had to wrestle with?
Well, the thing is that there's a very contentious thing, because I don't like making the audience's reaction the responsibility of the content creator, because by this standard, then, like, the Young Turks have caused police shootings, and I don't want to lay police shootings at their feet. It seems unfair, because I'm sure if you ask them, they'd be like, "No, I don't want people to shoot police." I was like, okay, maybe you should consider your rhetoric then, I suppose. And the thing is, when we do that, we assume that the person who has actually watched the media and then acted is not themselves a moral agent. Yeah. They don't make any decisions. They are an automaton that has been programmed to go and do X. That's not the case. You know, we have to treat people as if they're moral agents, because they are moral agents. Otherwise, we're going to be treating them as if, effectively, they're...
Okay, yeah, I'm coming at it from a different angle. I'm not coming at it from how should you be shamed for what somebody else does, but as a moral agent, you have the power. Your words are multiplied exponentially. I'm sure none of us could imagine the number of people who, like, really imagine like the power that your words have because of your platform. So how do you navigate internally that responsibility, and how has that kind of changed or caused you to even reassess your values to make them more stable? Has that occurred?
The whole thing has been a strange journey. I didn't realize how much I didn't know when I started. I didn't realize how much I'd have to study to get to this point, and I'm not nearly near the end either. Okay. I can tell. But the question of not being captured by your own audience is an interesting one, and I think that this is something that a lot of people have problems with, because having constant positive feedback really does distort your opinion of yourself, and so you are in many ways obliged to watch criticisms of yourself if you want to maintain a neutral or balanced, not even neutral, just a balanced perspective. But this is obviously yes, exactly. But this can be quite difficult, because YouTube is a performance piece. It's a sport. When you're doing these things, and so people's responses to you can be quite aggressive, and doubtless I'm sure I've done my fair amount of aggressive responses. Like I said, I'm not saying I'm perfect or I've always been virtuous or anything of the sort. This is just something I've come to appreciate the value of in my time doing this.
Do you think that it's always a sport, or that's just how where you grew up? Even for the people who are saying it's not a sport, it's a sport. They just play it in a different way to the people who make it obvious that it's a sport. It's because I always hated these channels that were called New York Libertarian. You know, if I started a channel New York Libertarian or something like that, you know exactly what you're gonna get from me. You know, libertarianism in a New Yorker accent. But it also means that once I've got 100,000 subscribers, I can't change my mind.
I'm stuck with that, aren't I?
Okay.
You know, you've got to be a libertarian because you've committed to it as the platform that you've built, and your audience will react very negatively if you're not reinforcing what they already believe in this regard. And then everyone knows that each sort of and even things like fandoms, you know, these things become in some way ideological. You know, in some way there becomes a consistency of view that you rely upon and you go to because you want to have something of yours confirmed, probably. So it becomes, some audiences can very easily trap people, but it's when you start losing your connection to reality that is when I think you start failing. I think that's when things start going wrong, and eventually you'll see, like, you know, 2 or 3 years down the line, these people have shrunk because what they're saying doesn't reflect reality, doesn't resonate with people.
Yeah, it doesn't resonate.
And so one thing that I always tell people, say in politics, in the realm of politics, one thing I always tell people is watch people you don't like, which means I have to watch. Oh my god, I have to watch some crap I hate. Like, I don't watch the Young Turks anymore. So I've got like a selection of, like, you know, centrist commentators, right wing commentators, left wing commentators, and I always recommend like the same like 3 or 4 people on each category. So I'm like, look, just you know, if you want to find out, like, and the individual matters as well. Like, some people will do a better job of covering X kind of topic than others. So this is why you want to keep a collection of them. Like, if I want to know what Donald Trump has done wrong, I'll go to someone like Ben Shapiro, because Ben Shapiro, personally, you can tell he hates Donald Trump. However, he also hates the Democrats. And so, you know, and this is why I like is, you know, there's good Trump and there's bad Trump. It's like, good, you know, Ben Shapiro has been dealing with Donald Trump for long enough to be able to give him a fair hearing if he does something right. It's difficult. Even people like, you know, David Pakman, who are the most sort of like rational of the left-wing commentary channels, even they struggle with that. But yeah, keep an array of different kinds of content creators, and don't always watch the same one, even if you personally really like their delivery. Just find someone you can tolerate and watch them, even if they say things you disagree with. It's okay for them to disagree with you. It's okay for you to disagree with them. You know, remember that that's their view when you hear it, and then that's it. Like, you just considered it. That's all.
It seems that there are conditions under which you can facilitate your own change of mind, or let's say a plasticity of opinion. And it seems like one way or another reality is going to catch up to you. So if you put if you try to have a as broad a spread as possible on what you're dealing with, you'll be able to catch yourself, you know, so at least your hands hit the floor before your face does in a certain way.
Yeah. Yep, that's a really good way of putting it. It's for your own good that you understand and engage with the criticisms of you and the subject that you're interested in.
So you're political then. You said in your 20s you weren't necessarily political. Now you're pretty political. You ran for office and stuff. What else is there for you? Like do you think that what's behind that? What's next? What's underneath that? Or is this the final form? So to speak.
Oh well, no, I don't think anything's our final form. That's the thing. I think you're a thing in motion. You're constantly in process, and it's up to you whether you get better at that or worse at that. It's your actions that will determine that. I've been working very hard, so hopefully I've been getting better. I suppose that when I'm finished figuring all of this out, I'll probably have to write a book at some point. Yeah, I mean, I just wish we understood ourselves better, which is something that's really frustrating that we don't. There's an awful lot of oughts that have been layered on society over the ises, and they contradict, and it's one of those things that they really don't want to talk about. I mean, the premier example is probably Charles Murray, who's a libertarian who wrote a book called The Bell Curve. I haven't read it myself, so I'm only reading secondhand accounts. It's one of those things I'll get to, I'm sure. But I think it's chapter 6 is regarding race and IQ. Now, the theme of the book is to question how we are going to prevent ourselves from becoming stratified by IQ. So there'll be a group of people who essentially aren't able to reach the upper echelons of society because the smartest people, scientists, doctors, lawyers, etc., they're the ones who occupy those. So he's worried that there'll be an intellectual caste system or something like that, I think, as I understand it. And if you believe in evolution and you believe that the brain is an organ, a physical part of your body, and you believe the consciousness is generated by the brain, then there is an evolutionary pressure and aspect to our consciousness. That's necessarily true. It has to be true. You can't get away from that.
And intelligence is something that was selected for over time.
Yes.
In certain environments, and maybe not in others.
I mean, I personally can't see what environment you wouldn't benefit from an increase in intelligence in. Right, so it seems to me there's always going to be some sort of
Instagram is a great example of an environment where.
All right, you got me. Yeah. I mean, in the real world, like if you're hunting, animals in Africa, or if you're hunting them in North America or Europe, it's still useful to be intelligent, isn't it? It's always going to be something that you would think evolution would select for. But I mean, I guess there are maybe different environments for. That have plenty in, and some environments that don't, that maybe make it more difficult, and you have to be smarter. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the problem as well is that there's a value judgment that is locked up in the statement that there has to be evolutionary pressure on the brain. I mean, it's just, we know that's the case. We know we've seen pre-human ancestors. We know how the brain has changed. We know that the different quality of our food, like cooking food, allows us to get more of the energy out of it, because more nutrients out of it, because we spend less energy from our own body to process it. That's the point of cooking it, is to break it down in advance of us eating it. So we know that there's been an evolutionary change because of that. Fire allows us to have these big brains, etc., etc. Okay, great. So, we accept that the brain is an organ, but as soon as you say there might be a difference because of heredity, that's verboten. You can't say that, because then you've contravened the reason position, which is all human beings are exactly the same, at least in principle, on paper. The blank slate theory is just not true. It was first advanced, I think it was by Locke, and it is just not true. Steven Pinker wrote a book all about it. It's just like this. There are definitely hardwired instincts in a person's head. The fact that it wasn't hardwired to use. It was something like a first draft. There's definitely a first draft of our instincts, but this can be rewired by training and habituation and teaching and things like this. And so humans aren't just blank slates. We know that IQ is heritable between children and parents. And so the idea that he can't even talk about that, is concerning. And it's, to me, it doesn't matter. It's not a moral judgment. It's, I've never made any kind of moral judgment about someone because of their intelligence. It's not under their control. So it doesn't change their human rights. It doesn't change. We don't hire people based on IQ. We don't do anything because of the metric of IQ, and yet it's become forbidden not because what we would do with it, but because what it signifies. It just signifies that the left-wing reason-based narrative is just not accurate. And we can't have that.
How do you convince people that are true believers that their belief in whichever spaghetti monster it is fallacious? Have you developed tools?
I don't think you can convince a true believer. No, that's the point. Their position's usually founded on faith, isn't it? But hopefully you can persuade other people who are watching and see them find themselves trapped in a position that's inescapable.
Oh,
but
okay.
That's the eternal question, isn't it? How do you persuade someone of your own position? It's not something I'm necessarily an expert on.
Do you think that is your position on this? Might sound completely out of the blue, but is your position on Brexit because of this underlying values between what you say is English values and the continental values? Do you think that it's just a fundamental cultural impossibility for that country and Europe to be wed?
I think it probably is. Ultimately, because of that distinction, but that wasn't the initial. That's not the immediate reason for it. I mean, personally, I don't agree that the European Union is a democratic entity. I think that sovereignty should be held in an accountable state where we can vote for the legislators, because we're the ones who's supposed to create the laws. We're supposed to be the origin of the laws and the sovereignty. Therefore, then we should have direct access to people who make laws. In the European Union, you don't. It begins with the Commission. They're the only part of the European Union that can propose laws, and they aren't elected by the people. Therefore, to me, that's
Are they
wrong.
appointed by some sort of divine right ceremony? Or
no, I can't remember exactly how it's done, but there's a committee or something that appoints them. I can't. But the point is, they somehow find their role, and I didn't cast a vote for them, so I don't care. It doesn't matter how. That's the legitimating factor, in my opinion. But also, the worldview is very much top-down, bureaucratic, systemic. We can, if we just have enough control, we can fix everything. It's like, maybe you could, but I don't want you to have control over me. Let's just assume you could do this. I don't care. I want to be the one who decides whether it's good for me to do X, Y, or Z. It's my choice. It's not your choice. I'm not, giving it away. And that was primarily the response from me. And I think underlying it instinctually in the sort of lizard brain, and it is primarily of the English as well in this case, because it was the English. If you look at what locations of the UK voted for Brexit, England is just leave. It's just a leave area, apart from the certain large cities. But the majority of England just wanted to leave, and I would say that this is probably an expression of the dichotomy between England and the continent in the way that they think. I think it is
an underlying value.
Yeah, I think it is the underlying values.
And do you think that those are always going to be at odds? Do you think that there's a meeting point where you began speaking about Platonism and the Aristotelian way of viewing the world? Is there a way to get back to a belief system that reinforces a behavior? Is there some sort of magical feedback?
Well, there are people who have tried to synthesize them. I mean, you've got lots of attempts, but I mean, like Kant and Mill were both trying to synthesize the two perspectives. And I'm not saying there is no view for Plato, because, I mean, the problem that Aristotle has is systemic injustice. There is such a thing as systemic injustice. I mean, Aristotle wasn't a liberal. He was in favor of slavery. He was in favor of censorship. He was in favor of a bunch of things that I, as a liberal, I'm like, no. That's government intervention that they don't have a right to do. But he didn't have the liberal framework to work from. So there are methods of synthesizing these things together. The problem is that
in the current political climate, like going forward now, are you just always going to be arguing against this other position? Is there any way to, instead of getting them to agree with you or change their mind, to show how they are actually heading in the same direction?
I'm sure that you can absolutely persuade anyone, but if you're not heading in the direction of communism, which I think continental philosophy is, then anything you say is going to be, as they view, something like reactionary. They're going to be like, well, you're arguing from tradition? Well, maybe sometimes when it's appropriate, not always, but sometimes some arguments can come from tradition, can't they? I mean, why not? Why is it that some cultures can and other cultures can't? Why is it that, this newly discovered Amazon tribe, oh, look at their sacred rituals. Okay, well, in Britain, we've got a bunch of silly sacred rituals that came from the ancient past. It's part of the British character and identity. Can we have those? No, because there's no reason for it. It's like, the reason is just that we've always done it. I mean, it sounds like an asinine reason, but things have been built on top of these reasons, know? Yeah. And so if you want the things that are built on top of them, you have to continue the tradition, even if the tradition is silly. Do it with a bit of irony if you have to. But it's still probably good to have the thing done. It creates a kind of order. But yeah, I think that this is the reason the left is so revolutionary. Anything that's created that isn't justified by reason must be leveled. It's got to be eradicated, because it'll be unjustified tyrannical oppression in some regard to the communist. But I don't agree that what they consider oppression is necessarily oppression. I mean, we should have different definitions of these things. And so essentially the Enlightenment is probably going to have to figure out a way of coexisting with and the advantage of tradition is that tradition deals very much with the human animal, deals very much with what people do, their bodily, like motions, the things that they have actually accomplished. And so it's evolutionary in and of itself. That's the thing. Tradition is evolutionary. It has evolved out of the past to solve problems that have come up, and these problems have been solved, which is how we've gone further. And then you get reason that looks back and goes, well, I don't understand how this solves all these problems. Get rid of it, and sweep it all away. This is why this is where revolutions come from, really. Like, look at most revolutions throughout history haven't really been what we would consider to be revolutions. Most, a province revolting from an empire is not ideological. It's just the desire for ethnic self-determination, which is something that we grant. It's a given. Yes, of course. The Polish should be. The Poles should be able to elect a Polish person to run Poland. Of course, a German should be running Germany. No, we don't even think about it twice, right? And prior to the Enlightenment, these sort of revolutions were religious. It was about theological differences. But the Enlightenment has made these political differences and made these radical as well. Like the communists and the fascists want genuinely radical change. And I don't want to just say, well, I'm a traditionalist, because I'm not really I would be ironically a traditionalist, I guess. Unironically ironic traditionalist. But I think there is some value in the traditional things that we did, and I do think they grant the character of the thing as well. And I don't like the idea of getting rid of, say, in my case, the British character. So we have to accept that comes from the British tradition. And if we're going to become communists and just sweep it all away, then we lose all that. And I think that is a shame, because I think there is something valuable in it, and I don't want to lose it, frankly.
Do you think that the current communist movement, as shown by the Bernie Sanders movement and different aspects of the political left in America, different organizations going in this direction, do you think that's going to burn itself out? Do you think that it's kind of just expending fuel? Can it stably kind of take over the country, or can it just hobble?
It won't be able to win elections yet. I think that the left has been essentially subversive. I can't think of a better term than subversive.
Labor lost pretty hardcore a few months ago. So
staggering.
Yeah. They seem to have doubled down in their rhetoric, at least from what I've seen, but I'm not too
the thing is, they have arguments that are persuasive in a group setting. So the argument itself isn't necessarily persuasive, but it's aggressive, and it uses thought-terminating cliches to essentially put you in the shame box. So in a public gathering, oh God, I don't want to be that person who's being called a racist, and therefore, but that doesn't translate to the ballot box, because people are not actually persuaded by this. They're just cowed into submission by this. And so then they go and vote with their conscience and how they believe. And it doesn't matter if a leftist could describe this as somehow shameful, they're still going to do it because it's what they believe. So I think that the left essentially shot its load too early. It thought that it had the monopoly on moral thoughts that it appeared to have in the media, it appeared to have in the governments. Because all of our institutions are leaning towards the left, because it wins these arguments in the public square, and it wins them through the shaming of people, the shutting down of things, through political correctness. And
in forms of collectivism. Collective reinforcement, I guess, of these positions then. Not just that. Like,
if you declare yourself to be the anti-racist crusader, it's very easy for you to be associated with anti-racism, even if you're actually a massive racist yourself. It doesn't matter. The person you're pointing at de facto becomes the racist, and therefore nobody wants to be trapped in that position. And so it's easy for people to just genuflect. And you'll see this with, like, people writing checks to, like, the ADL and stuff like this. Oh, what happened? Were you accused of something on social media? There's 50 grand gone. It becomes a bit like a racket. But I think they overestimated their own influence. I think that they thought they had a bigger vote share than they did, and it turns out that actually the traditionalist vote share has a much bigger block in Britain anyway, and I think that's probably going to be the case in America. I'm actually gutted it's not Bernie Sanders as the nominee, because I think Bernie's going to get absolutely crushed if he were the guy. He's supported too many communist regimes for, I think, Americans in particular to vote for him. I think American boomers are going to look at Bernie Sanders and go, no. They'll sign up to the Ronald Reagan slogan of "Make America Great Again." I think. Yeah.
If the left disappeared tomorrow, would you end up kind of distancing yourself from the right? Do you think that there needs to be some sort of political dichotomy in the large sense of the term, a spectrum? And
can we make this the last question? Is that all right?
Yeah. We should wrap up. Thank you.
It's getting on.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think. Ultimately, the left, I don't think, can disappear. It's always going to be with us in some form, because it's an outgrowth of Enlightenment thought, which is an outgrowth of the English-speaking world, and therefore we were probably on rails that will eventually get us to that point regardless. We've got to essentially synthesize out of it that which is true into what we already had, and then carry on that way. I don't think it can disappear, and I don't think that any political view has such a comprehensively correct view of reality that it won't end up generating its own antithesis from the things that it fails to observe. For example, communist taking over is going to spawn a liberty movement, a libertarian movement that wants constitutional government and personal freedom and all this sort of stuff, because communism doesn't account for the natural desire to have those things. And so those people who feel oppressed by not having those things are forced to coalesce into a political movement to have their grievances addressed, or get shot and gulagged, however it goes. And so, there is always going to be this kind of roil of new ideas, new desires, and new problems because of the current order. But hopefully we can keep it on a manageable level, so we don't all end up in a giant civil war and the boogaloo arrives, and then the communists get what they deserve.
As do we, whether we deserve it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, liberals get the bullet too, as a communist famously wrote on the wall of Berkeley University during the Antifa riots there. Liberals get the bullet too.
Yeah. Proto-fascists, we all know that.
Yeah, well, fascists came out with socialists. What do you expect?
Well, thank you so much, Carl, for your evening time. This is a great delight, and thanks for letting me speak with you and pick your brain about this stuff. My
pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And like I said, a lot of what I've said is not fully finished. It's just the way I've been understanding things recently. It's not perfect, and I'm doubtless going to revise this in the future, but I think I've got a few points hammered home that I think I can be sure of. And
I appreciate hearing the not just the finished thought, but the way that somebody's wrestling with it. That's more alive to me than the polished.
Me too. This is why I do stuff like this, because it's fun, even if I'm not writing a treatise or something. It's entertaining, But no, thanks for inviting me on. This has been really good fun.
Excellent. Thank you. Have a good night.
I will. Thanks very much. Cheers.
All right. Ciao. Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.